The padlock on my son's lockup in Petone hadn't been opened in 11 months. I knew because I was the one who'd snapped it shut the morning after we put him in the ground at Taupō Cemetery, when my hands wouldn't stop shaking and I couldn't bring myself to walk into a metal box full of his things. 11 months of driving past that row of orange roller doors on State Highway 2 every time I went to pick up groceries. 11 months of telling the woman at the front office I'd come in next fortnight. Next month. After Christmas. After the anniversary. And then my daughter-in-law sat across from me at my own kitchen table in Stokes Valley, slid a printed letter from the storage company across the wood with her good nails clicking, and told me with a small, careful smile that if I didn't have it cleared by the Friday after next, the company would auction the lot of it for back rent. She had already taken the house in Kandala. She had taken the Kiwi Saver, the joint term deposit, the life insurance from his work that paid out $190,000 on a Tuesday in February. My son James had been a meticulous man. He worked as a structural engineer for a firm down on the Wellington waterfront, and he kept a spreadsheet for the weekly shopping. He had written his own will the year he turned 40, paid a solicitor in Lower Hutt $800 to make it clean and proper, and left the lot to the woman he had married 12 years before. That was his decision. I never raised a word against it. But when she stood at the wake in our local RSA with a glass of Sauvignon Blanc in her hand and told my neighbor she was thinking about pulling out the kitchen and putting in marble, something in me went very still and very cold and stayed that way. Her name was Charlotte. She had gray-green eyes and a laugh that filled a room like sunshine through a sash window. James had loved that laugh from the first night he met her at a friend's barbecue in Island Bay when he was 34 years old. They never had children. They had the villa in Kandala with the harbor view, and a Subaru and an Audi parked in the drive, and a savings account that had taken James 15 years of long days to build. All of it was hers now, and she wanted me to clear the lockup by Friday so the storage company could let the unit out to somebody else. I drove down to Petone on a Thursday morning in late autumn, when the poplars along the foreshore had turned the color of old gold and the sky over the harbor was that particular soft gray we get here in May. I sat in my Hilux in the car park for 19 minutes before I could bring myself to open the door. I know it was 19 minutes because I kept watching the digital clock above the radio. I'm not a man who weeps easily. I'm 68 years old. I grew up on a sheep station outside Masterton with a father who thought a man's emotions belonged in the wool shed and nowhere else. But sitting there in the car park with the diesel engine ticking as it cooled, I felt the kind of grief that doesn't come with tears at all. It comes with a heaviness in the chest. It comes with the knowledge that the person you loved most in the world is gone, and nothing you do for the rest of your life will change that. James was my only child. His mother, my wife Margaret, passed when he was 9 years old, a quick, brutal cancer that took her between one Christmas and the next, and after that it had been just the two of us in the old weatherboard house in Stokes Valley. I worked as a caretaker for the Hutt City Council for 31 years, mostly looking after the parks and the sports grounds out at Nainai and Wainuiamata. And I put every cent I could spare into James's schooling. He was the first in our family to get a degree. He went to Victoria University and then did his honors at Canterbury. And he used to ring me every Sunday evening at 6 o'clock without fail. Even after he married Charlotte, even after the conversations got a bit shorter and a bit more careful in what they said. The last time I spoke to him was the Sunday before Easter weekend. 10 days before he went into Wellington Hospital with what they thought at first was just a chest infection and turned out to be something far worse. He was 46 years old when he died. I unlocked the roller door and pushed it up on its rails. The unit was tidier than I'd been bracing for. James had always been like that. Storage bins along the left wall with neat printed labels, a workbench at the back with his tools arranged on a pegboard exactly the way I'd taught him to do when he was a teenager, and in the middle of the space, draped under an old wool blanket, something tall and angular. I stood in the doorway for a moment, letting my eyes get used to the dim light. Then I walked in and pulled the blanket back. It was a writing desk. A roll top, the proper old-fashioned kind, made of kauri that had been stripped and re-oiled until the timber glowed warm in the gloom. I knew the desk straight away. It had been my father's. When the old man passed back in 2004, I'd had nowhere to put it in my place, and James had offered to mind it for me until I had room. I ran my hand along the edge of the kauri, and as my fingers slid under the lip of the roll top, they brushed against something flat and stiff and out of place. An envelope, taped to the underside of the wood, hidden in such a way that you would only ever find it if you lifted the roll and felt along the inside edge with your fingertips. My name was on the front of the envelope, in James's careful printing. I sat down on the concrete floor of that lockup, and I opened it. There was one sheet of folded paper inside, and a small brass key on a length of green twine. The note said, "Dad, if you've got this in your hands, then things have gone the way I was afraid they would. I haven't got a lot of room here, so I'll keep it short. Go to the Westpac on Queens Drive in Lower Hutt. The key is for the safe deposit box there. Bring your driver's license, and don't tell anyone you're going. Not anyone. I love you more than I ever managed to say out loud. And I'm sorry I didn't say it more often. James." I read it through 4 times. Then I folded it in half along the crease he had made, slid it back into the envelope, put the brass key in the breast pocket of my work shirt against my heart, and sat there on the cold concrete for a long while, listening to a magpie carrying on somewhere up in the gum tree by the fence line. He had known. Somehow my boy had known. I almost didn't go that afternoon. It was already gone 1 o'clock, and I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. But there was something about the weight of that little brass key in my pocket that made me feel as though James was standing just behind my left shoulder, the way he used to stand when he was 8 years old and wanting to ask me a question but hadn't quite worked out where to start. I pulled the roller door down, snapped the new padlock on it, and drove the 15 minutes up Queens Drive to the bank. The teller who took me through was a woman called Ranji. She had the patient, unhurried manner of someone who'd spent a great many years making sure nothing she saw across that counter took her by surprise. I showed her my license. I told her my son had passed and left me a key. She looked the account up on her screen, and after a moment she said, very gently, that James had added me as a co-signatory on the box 22 months ago, which would have been about 11 months before his diagnosis. She walked me through to a small private room at the back, set a long gray metal box on the table in front of me, and closed the door behind her with a soft click. I sat there for a moment, with my hands flat on the laminate. Then, I lifted the lid. There were 3 things inside: a thick manila envelope, packed full of papers, a smaller white envelope with the words, "Read this one first," Dad written on the front in James's block printing, and underneath them both, a photograph in a clear plastic sleeve taken on a fishing trip up at Lake Taupō when James was about 10. The 2 of us squinting against the sun off the water, both grinning like fools, holding up a brown trout that was probably smaller than I remember it being. I picked up the smaller envelope first. The letter inside ran to nearly 4 pages, written by hand in that careful block printing he used whenever he wanted to make sure something was readable. He had used a black biro and pressed hard into the paper. "Dad," it began, "I want to tell you straight off that I thought about all of this very carefully. And I'm hoping you'll be able to understand the choices I made, even where some of them are hard to hear. Charlotte and I haven't been in a good place for a long time now. I won't put the whole of it down on paper, but I'll tell you the parts you need to know. About 2.5 years ago, I worked out that she had been moving money out of our joint accounts into an account in her name only, an ASB account I never had any access to. I hired a forensic accountant in Wellington, a fellow called Nigel Roburn, and what he came back to me with was worse than I'd been bracing myself for. She had moved roughly $72,000 over a stretch of 19 months. I also found out, through Nigel and through other channels I won't bore you with, that she had been carrying on with somebody else for the best part of 7 years. Most of our marriage, in other words. I set the letter down on the table in front of me and looked at the photograph for a long moment. The boy in the picture was missing one of his front teeth. Then I picked the letter back up. I went to see a family law solicitor in Wellington called Helen Tarrant. I've put her business card and her direct line in the manila envelope. Helen gave me a clear picture of where I stood. Because of how my will was written, and because the relationship property hadn't yet been divided, if I died before our separation went through, Charlotte would inherit everything. So I started the separation process last winter. But Dad, I have to tell you something now that I should have told you in person. I was already unwell by then. I had been to see specialists at Wellington Hospital. And the timeline I'd been given wasn't certain, but it wasn't long either. I was worried I might not have the time to see the separation through to the end. So I went a different way about it. In the manila envelope you will find the full forensic accountant's report and bank records, a sworn statement from Nigel Roburn, the documentation of the separation application, which has been filed with the family court but has not yet been formally served on Charlotte for legal reasons, that Helen will explain to you, a fresh will signed and witnessed 9 months ago in Palmerston North by a senior estate lawyer called Davis Mahoney, drafted specifically so it would stand up to any challenge, and a list of every contact you'll need to ring. I had to stop reading there. I sat with my hand over my mouth for a moment. The new will leaves everything to you, Dad. And there's more. 6 months ago, I shifted the bulk of our investments into a family trust with you as the sole beneficiary. The trust is separate from my estate altogether, and the documentation for that is in there as well. The total value, all up, comes to around $340,000 on top of what Charlotte has already taken. I know this is a great deal to take in. I'm sorry I never told you any of this while I was alive. I was trying to keep you from worrying. And if I'm being honest, I was a bit ashamed of myself for letting things drift as long as I did before I acted. But I want you to understand that I thought it through properly. Helen Tarrant knows the whole of it, and she's expecting your call. One more thing. Please don't be angry on my account. I made my peace with how it ended between Charlotte and me. What I want is for you to look after yourself. Get the roof done on the house. Buy that little dinghy you've been talking about for 15 years. Take yourself up to Taupō for a week. I want you to be all right. I love you, Dad. I'm sorry I never got to say goodbye to you properly. You were always the very best part of my life. James. I don't know how long I sat in that little room. Rangi knocked on the door eventually, very softly. The kind of knock that knew time worked differently in there than it did out by the counter. I told her through the door I'd be a few more minutes. I gathered everything carefully back into the box, tucked the photograph into my breast pocket next to the brass key, and walked out into the afternoon light on Queen's Drive, feeling as though I was carrying something I didn't yet know how to set down. I rang Helen Tarrant from the footpath outside the bank. She picked up on the second ring, and when I gave her my name, she went very quiet and then said, "Mr. Pemberton, I've been hoping you would ring me. Your son spoke about you a great deal. He was extremely proud of you." I had to stand there with the phone pressed to my ear and the autumn wind coming up off the harbor for a long moment before I could trust my voice enough to answer her. She walked me through it that afternoon, and again the next morning in her office in Wellington, in the calm, methodical way of somebody who had already worked the whole thing out in her own head months earlier. The separation filing created a legal complication for the existing will. The new will, drafted by Davis Mahoney up in Palmerston North with 2 independent witnesses and a justice of the peace, was valid and superseded the older document. The family trust James had set up was a separate matter from the estate altogether, and the assets in it had transferred to me automatically when he died. 8 days after the funeral, very quietly, with no announcement at all. Charlotte had no idea any of this existed. The forensic report, paired with the bank records, amounted to evidence of relationship property fraud, which Helen explained was a separate matter from the inheritance, but a serious one. I asked her what she thought I should do first. She said, "Ring a litigation solicitor. I can give you 3 names in the hut. And Mr. Pemberton, please don't put it off. File to set aside the existing will this week, on the strength of the new one. The sooner it's in front of a judge, the better." I drove home through the back roads that wind up over the Belmont Hills, the way James and I used to go on Sunday afternoons when he was a teenager, and we didn't need to say much to each other to enjoy the company. The poplars along the ridge were the color of old gold. It was a very beautiful afternoon, and I thought about my boy nearly the whole drive. I rang my old friend Bruce that night. Bruce had been a solicitor in Lower Hutt for 34 years before he half-retired, and he'd helped me once with a fence line argument I'd had with a neighbor back in the 90s. He listened to the whole thing without saying a word. When I'd finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Henry, your boy, we star young fellow." "He was that," I said. "Bring everything round to mine in the morning. We'll get a start on it." The next 4 months were not easy. I want to be honest about that. Nothing in the law goes quickly, and Charlotte hired herself a solicitor out of Wellington who was sharp and expensive and made the going as hard as he knew how. She lodged a challenge to the second will. She argued that James hadn't been of sound mind when he signed it. She questioned whether the family trust was properly constituted. None of it stuck. The 2 witnesses to the will were a senior partner at his engineering firm and a chartered accountant who had known James professionally for 15 years. Both of them sober, credible men with no skin in the game. The justice of the peace had kept her records in good order. The medical notes from Wellington Hospital made it perfectly clear that James, although ill, had been entirely lucid and mentally sharp at the time of signing. And the trust deed had been drafted by Davis Mahoney, who had been doing contested estate work in this country for 35 years, and who I came to understand James had chosen on purpose, with exactly this scenario in mind. The relationship property fraud, the $72,000 she had moved, opened up a separate civil matter that I chose not to pursue myself, because James had asked me not to be angry on his behalf, and I tried very hard to honor that. But the documentation went to the right people, and that process began moving on its own without me having to push it. In late September, in a courtroom on Lambton Quay in Wellington, the judge ruled that the second will was valid and the family trust stood. Charlotte was in the courtroom that morning. I won't say much about how she looked when the ruling came down. I will only say that she stood up at the bar table in her good navy suit and her good handbag, and as the registrar read the orders, the color went out of her face slowly from the top down, like a glass emptying, and her solicitor put his papers in his briefcase and didn't quite meet her eye when she turned to ask him a question. I sat in the public gallery next to Bruce. He didn't say anything. He just put his hand on my forearm for a moment, and I understood what he meant by it. I'm not a man who throws the word justice around lightly. I grew up in a household where that word carried real weight, where it didn't get used to dress up small grievances or settle scores. But sitting in that courtroom that morning, with the spring light coming through the high windows, I felt that something which had been knocked out of true had been quietly set right again. Not the grief. The grief doesn't go anywhere. But something else. Something my boy had worked very hard in the last months of his life to put in proper order, the way he used to line his pencils up on his desk when he was a child. I used some of the money to put a new roof on the old weatherboard, which had needed doing for 3 winters. I bought a little aluminium dinghy with a 4-stroke Yamaha, the kind I'd been looking at in the back of the New Zealand Fishing News for longer than I care to admit, and a trailer to tow it behind the Hilux. I set up a small scholarship in James's name at Victoria University, in the engineering faculty, ring-fenced for students from Hutt Valley, state schools whose parents hadn't been to university themselves. It wasn't a huge scholarship. It was enough to cover books and bus fares for a year. But it had his name on it, and that mattered to me. I take the dinghy up to Lake Taupō a few times a year now. In the early mornings before the wind comes up, I take it out into the middle of the lake where the noise of the road falls away behind the hills. And there's nothing but the water and the bush. And the first light coming up over Mount Tauhara. I think about what James wrote to me in that letter, that I was always the very best part of his life. I have that photograph in a wooden frame on the mantelpiece now, the one from the safe deposit box. Two of us squinting into the sun. A trout that was almost certainly smaller than we remembered. I look at it every morning when I come into the kitchen to put the jug on. I think about how a person can love you so quietly, so carefully, so thoroughly, that even after they're gone, the love is still doing its work in the world. Still finding you in car parks and lockups and small back rooms at the Westpac, still holding the door open for you, still pointing the way down the track. I think about that on the mornings when the grief sits heaviest in my chest. And it helps. It really does help. I told my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Aroha Witiora, about all of it eventually. She is 76 years old and she has known James since he was 12. And she cried when I told her what he had done. She said to me, "Henry, your boy looked after you all the way to the end and beyond." I didn't have a ready answer for that. I just nodded over the fence and went back inside to put the kettle on. But that night, sitting on the back step with a cup of tea in my hand and the lights coming on one by one along Stokes Valley Road, I turned her words over in my head for a long time, all the way to the end and beyond. I thought about how some kinds of love don't just stop when a person stops. They keep moving forward in the world on their own steam, through papers signed and trust deeds filed, and brass keys taped to the underside of an old kauri desk, and letters written in steady block printing by a man who knew he was running out of time and was determined his father would be all kauri desk. Right. I want to say something now to anyone listening who might be in the middle of a loss of their own, in that particular silence where the person you love used to be standing. Pay close attention to what they have left behind. Not only the things, the photographs and the bits and pieces, but the choices they made, the careful arrangements, the doors they propped open for you to walk through, even when they could no longer walk through with you. People show you who they are by what they do for you when nobody is watching. And very often, the deepest love a person carries for you only becomes visible after the fact in the shape of the things they thought to organize on your behalf. There are a few other things I want to say before I finish. Things I have learned in this last year that I think are worth passing on. The first is this. If you have somebody in your life you love, please do tell them. Out loud. In actual words. Don't wait until it has to be done in a letter sealed inside an envelope taped under a desk. James and I loved each other very deeply for nearly half a century. And we said it to each other perhaps a dozen times in all those years, and I would give a great deal now to have said it to him 100 times more. Don't make my mistake. Tell the people in your life what they mean to you while they are still standing in front of you to hear it. The second thing is about paperwork, which I know is not a romantic subject, but bear with me. Make a will. Keep it current. If your circumstances change, change the will. James was 46 years old, and he had thought to put his affairs in order in a way most men twice his age never get round to. It saved me. It would have been so much worse without his foresight. Don't leave that job for the people you love to sort out in the worst week of their lives. The third thing is harder to put plainly, but I'll try. Be careful who you let close to the people you love. I am not saying you should be suspicious of everyone. I'm saying that watchfulness is a kind of love too. If something seems off in how a person treats your son or your daughter, trust your gut, and don't go quiet about it just because you don't want to cause a fuss. James kept Charlotte's behavior to himself for too long because he was ashamed and didn't want me to worry. I would much rather have worried with him than have him carry the weight of it alone. And the last thing is this. Grief does not finish. Anyone who tells you it does has not been on the inside of it. What it does is change shape over time. The way a stone in a river changes shape, slowly, under the steady pressure of the water passing over it. 11 months in, I could not look at my son's name without my throat closing up. 2 years in, I can speak about him to a stranger in a queue at the supermarket. The grief is still there. It is still as heavy as it ever was, but I have learned to carry it differently, and so will you, in time, if this is the road you find yourself on. My son left me a brass key on a piece of green twine. It was taped to the underside of a kauri roll-top desk that had belonged to his grandfather, inside a storage unit on the Petone foreshore that I very nearly walked away from. The key opened a box at a bank in Lower Hutt that changed the rest of my life. But the thing that mattered most was never inside the box. The thing that mattered most was the letter. And what the letter told me, plainly and without dressing it up, was that I had been loved all along, very carefully and very thoroughly, by a son who took the trouble to look after me when he could no longer be there to do it himself, all the way to the end and beyond. If this story has touched you somewhere, do me a favor. Tell me in the comments where in the country you're listening from. I'd like to know whose lounges and kitchens and long drives this is finding its way into. And while you're there, tell me whether somebody you loved ever did a thing for you that you didn't find out about until much later. I'd very much like to read those stories. And if you are new to the channel, welcome to Silver Stories. Pull up a chair. Put the jug on. There's plenty more where this came from. And we'd be glad to have you stay a while.